Welcome to the Healing Pain Podcast with Dr. Joe Tatta. Each week, we interview top experts in physical therapy, pain science, and integrative pain care. You'll learn the most up-to-date information for treating and reversing persistent pain. This podcast is for educational purposes only and not intended to be used as personalized medical advice. And now, here's your host, Dr. Joe Tatta.
Hey there, welcome to this week's episode of the Healing Pain Podcast. On today's episode, we are discussing how a low glutamate diet effectively improves pain and fatigue in veterans diagnosed with Gulf War illness. My expert guest this week is Dr. Kathleen Holton. She is an associate professor in the Department of Health Sciences at American University and is also affiliated with the Center for Behavioral Neuroscience. She is a nutritional neuroscientist whose research examines the negative effects of food additives on neurological symptoms, as well as the positive protective effects of certain micronutrients on the brain. The main focus of her research is on glutamate, which is an excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain. This becomes dysregulated in many neurologic conditions, including chronic pain, migraine, multiple sclerosis, depression, anxiety, and PTSD. I enjoyed speaking with Kathleen on this topic. Much of her research informs how we treat people with chronic pain by using nutrition in clinical practice. And without further ado, let's begin and let's meet Dr. Kathleen Holton. Hey there, Kathleen. Welcome back to the Healing Pain Podcast. It's great to have you here again.
Thank you for having me.
How long was it since you were on last? I was looking through the records and I can't remember, but I had you on where you were talking about a similar topic with regard to fibromyalgia, right?
Yes. Yeah. I think it was a couple years ago, maybe.
Yeah. Time does fly, but it obviously gave you time to run a really nice randomized controlled trial, which had some really interesting outcomes that I'm excited to share with everyone. So everyone can access this paper. It's in the August 2020 Journal of Nutrients. And the paper is called The Low Glutamate Diet Effectively Improves Pain and Other Symptoms of Gulf War Illness. And a really interesting paper, and of course, an interesting population of people to be working with that I'm sure we're thankful to be enrolled in this study because they had good outcomes. I think a good place to start is to just tell us what Gulf War illness is and what some of those symptoms are that people struggle with.
Sure. So Gulf War illness is the name given to a multi-symptom illness that is really, really common in veterans of the Gulf War. You might remember, the Gulf War was a very short conflict. It's like 1990 to 1991. So people were not actually in that conflict for a huge amount of time, but they had a ton of neurotoxic exposures while they were over there. And what we found is a huge proportion of those people are coming down with this multi-symptom illness. It is very similar to fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome in that it has this similar spectrum of symptoms. So they usually have widespread chronic pain and fatigue. And they also have other symptoms like most of them have headaches or migraines. They have a lot of cognitive dysfunction. So problems with memory, problems with attention. They'll talk about the brain fog, similar to someone with fibromyalgia. They have a lot of comorbid mood disorders. So we see a lot of depression, anxiety, and PTSD, which are more common in veterans in general. We also see other things like problems with sleep, a lot of gastrointestinal problems. And the symptoms that really set them apart are sometimes we will see symptoms like skin issues and respiratory problems. Those are unique to those in the Gulf War that would be separate from someone with fibromyalgia.
Interesting. So you mentioned an extreme burden or an overexposure to neurotoxins from the war. And I know we're learning a lot about the condition. Is the theory that the toxins are still potentially inside our bodies, or just that somehow it damaged the central and the peripheral nervous system?
Yeah, so we don't think that they're still inside. Well, I guess there is a case where it'd still be inside. You could have depleted uranium exposure, and so someone could have shrapnel inside of them, and we do see veterans with shrapnel where they might be having a continued exposure to something inside of them. Outside of that, though, it was more of an acute exposure that causes a change in the nervous system. A lot of these substances actually affect a different neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. But what we know is that acetylcholine downstream affects glutamate. And so a lot of the toxicity of these compounds actually is mediated by glutamate downstream. And this is why it was of interest to me. Not only had I had those positive results in fibromyalgia patients who have a similar spectrum of symptoms, but also we know that glutamate's being affected downstream. So there was a potential there that the low glutamate diet might be able to help.
So this is good. We're going on a little kind of neurophysiology tour here. So just take us back. So acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter that gets released in the synaptic cleft and helps one nerve communicate with another nerve.
Yeah, all neurotransmitters is basically because in our nervous system, our nerves get close together, but they don't actually touch. And so we have this chemical released that allows that signal to be passed on.
So downstream, it has an effect on glutamate. And tell us why glutamate is important potentially for people with pain.
Yeah, so glutamate actually has been very well documented to play a huge role in pain neurotransmission. As a matter of fact, in chronic pain conditions where someone has pain for a long period of time, we know that there's actually a change in the nervous system that upregulates glutamate and glutamatergic neurotransmission. Now, glutamate's job is to excite the next neuron in line, so we call it an excitatory neurotransmitter. Glutamate's also called an excitotoxin because in high amounts, it actually can overexcite a neuron to the point that that neuron dies. And this would be the case in something like a neurodegenerative condition, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, Huntington's chorea. That's really where you're seeing a lot of death of neurons. That's all mediated by glutamate. When we talk about pain and depression, anxiety, PTSD, all of these are mediated by glutamate. It's just that glutamatergic neurotransmission may be overexciting things, but we don't necessarily know if it's causing death of neurons. So in these Gulf War veterans, it could be that the acute exposure period, they had death of neurons. Over time, we have this dysregulation that has kind of continued inside of the nervous system.
Really interesting. And then I guess we should talk about where glutamate is found in the diet and how it actually enters our nervous system.
Yeah. So typically, if you're a healthy person, you could eat lots of glutamate in your diet and it probably wouldn't affect you. We have what's called our blood-brain barrier that really protects us from high levels of things that are circulating in our blood supply. But what we notice is that the people who tend to be sensitive to glutamate in their diet tend to be people who have conditions or something has happened that could have made that blood-brain barrier permeable. I'll give you some examples. Head injury, infection, high amounts of stress, neurotoxic exposures. So you can think of a veteran, they have lots of these put together, right? They talk about high stress. You know, how can you get higher stress than being worried about dying, right, when you're in a conflict? So, but they also had neurotoxic exposures, and they also many times had head injuries and stuff that occurred. In the case of something like fibromyalgia, we'll see it, people start having symptoms after a car accident where they hit their head. A lot of things like that are pretty common. And really my hypothesis is that we're seeing these things are causing permeability of the blood-brain barrier, allowing dietary glutamate now to get to their brain in higher amounts. So glutamate is found in the diet in two forms. The first form is bound, and this would be something like meat. So if you're eating animal foods, all of that would have glutamate in it, the protein structure, but it's all bound together in that big protein. That does not appear to cause people problems. People eat meat with no problem. Really where we see the problem is with free glutamate. Now, free glutamate is added to foods purposefully, and it's because it actually has flavor-enhancing properties. And that is because we have neurons in our tongue that help us to taste. And so if you've heard of the umami flavor, that comes from the taste of MSG. MSG is just glutamate attached to one sodium molecule. And of course, we love the taste of sodium. And now we also like the taste of glutamate. So we put glutamate in foods and then people like it. It excites the neurons in our tongue and makes us like that food more. And so we keep eating it. So the food industry loves glutamate and it's added to a ton of products under a myriad of names. And so majority of your exposure is really through food additives. The exception to that would be there are some foods that contain free glutamate in high amounts naturally. And this would be things like soy sauce, fish sauces, seaweed. If you had tomato sauce a lot, tomato sauce has a little bit of free glutamate in it. So aged cheeses would be another great example. As you age a cheese, it releases free glutamate as part of that process. And so we restrict those foods as well on the diet.
So some things that are, of course, are processed or packaged or convenience foods, and then some that are natural foods that you just kind of make people aware that as they age, or potentially some of these foods have more free glutamate in there. So it's interesting because it's kind of like this double whammy of you have a nervous system that has been impacted in some way so that there's now a hypersensitivity as well as a leaky blood-brain barrier. And at the same time, we're adding extra glutamate to the system, which adds to that sensitivity.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of model for central sensitization, which is talked about a lot in the literature.
Yeah, and central sensitization is a great example where I was saying there's an alteration to your actual nervous system. It's similar to long-term potentiation. Long-term potentiation is really useful in something like memory. We have glutamate plays a huge role in long-term potentiation to help us remember something for a longer period of time, which is great. But central sensitization is almost like that same kind of change is happening to the nervous system, upregulating that excitation in a bad way, where we end up having that pain signal for a longer period of time.
Excellent.
Easily, I should say.
So I have one more kind of really technical neurophysiological question, and then I want to go into kind of some of the details about your RCT. But in the realm of central sensitization, we talk about microglial activation or microglia that are kind of hypercharged, if you will, in the nervous system. Microglia and astrocytes are kind of similar. How does that play into what we're talking about here today?
So we call microglia and astrocytes glial cells, but they kind of have some similarities but differences. Astrocytes are actually very important for taking glutamate out of that synaptic cleft, that area between the neurons. And if we don't want glutamate to overexcite things, we need that astrocyte to function to take glutamate out of the synaptic cleft. So if we have some kind of dysregulation at the astrocyte level, like it can't use energy appropriately, it'll stop taking glutamate up, and that could cause a problem. Glial cells are really part of your immune system and in the brain and the rest of your body too, but especially in the brain, when we talk about like an infection or trauma to the brain, your microglial cells would be activated to help with that acute injury. However, when we have long-term problems like chronic pain or other issues that are just, depression, other things, we know that there is a neuroinflammation that's occurring by these microglial cells and that they're being activated and it's causing long-term problems. What's really fascinating is the microglial cells actually have an intimate connection to glutamatergic neurotransmission. As a matter of fact, I just finished a book chapter on this. And so we have some cytokines that are released by microglial cells, and cytokines are messengers. Basically, they're like little alert signals to say, we should ramp up ourselves because we have an invader. And so they're, like I said, not good when they shouldn't be there. We have two of them, IL-1 beta and TNF alpha, are cytokines that actually can cause abnormal glutamatergic neurotransmission. They increase that excitation. Now that increased excitation in glutamate actually can do the same thing where it can upregulate the activity and the release of cytokines. So you kind of have this circular pattern. We also have a third piece to it called oxidative stress. And if you guys have heard of free radicals, oxidative stress is bad for us too and causes damage. And that is really countered by antioxidants in the diet. So interestingly, it's also a place where diet could have a bigger effect than some medications.
Wonderfully said. And the reason why I wanted to just kind of dip our toe into that is because I often get emails from people with pain as well as certain licensed health professionals who just want to kind of dump more GABA into the system to offset glutamate. And it's kind of, to me, that's it's almost like using a supplement as a pharmaceutical, where you're not really changing or influencing the cause of really what you're talking about is a systems approach to optimizing the nervous system.
Yeah. You know why I'm opposed to that idea. And this is the same as a drug effect in that when we take a drug and we take something that's GABAergic in any manner, what our bodies do is they say, oh, that's too much inhibition from GABA. Let me put out more glutamate to balance everything out, because our bodies are all about that homeostasis, right? And so by doing dietary manipulation, what we're doing is we're helping everything calm down and go back to homeostasis. We're not putting something in that our body wants to oppose. And I really think that that's what GABA does. Is it's the same thing if you drink alcohol, to be honest with you. Alcohol is GABAergic. It's what we call GABA agonist. It has a GABA effect. And what our body does is goes, ooh, too much inhibition. We should release some more glutamate to balance things out a little bit. So people who have things like chronic widespread pain, or you'll hear people a lot who have insomnia, who will talk about the fact that if they drink alcohol, they notice that they're awake at night. And part of the reason for that is as the GABA effect wears off, their body has increased its glutamate production, and it leads to insomnia in the middle of the night. So yeah, I'm in agreement with you.
Perfect. So you always have to change the diet first. That's, of course, the take-home message. So with that, tell us about your study and tell us about how you had these really wonderful results. And I just want to point out, and we can talk about this too, is that you had a large effect size from the study, which is really important in research. And that's really, for those clinicians and licensed health professionals and researchers who are listening, obviously that's something that I just want to point out and mention. But tell us about your study and what happened with the participants.
So we recruited 40 veterans of the Gulf War from across the country. All of these veterans had Gulf War illness. We brought them into DC. We did baseline measurements on everyone. And then they were randomized to either start the diet immediately or into a waitlisted control group. The waitlisted control group had the option to have the diet at the end of that waitlisted control month, and then they got to go on the diet as well. So everyone had the opportunity for benefit. Everyone underwent nutrition training with me via Skype. We also gave everybody a lot of information with materials to help them follow the diet, and they had access to me throughout the month. Then we brought them back to DC. We did a post-diet assessment, and this is really to see, did they get better? Did anything change? And then everyone after that post-diet assessment goes on to a double-blind, placebo-controlled crossover challenge. So basically how this is set up is that's over 2 weeks. We bring them in for 3 days after they fast overnight. And we give them pills, and they're randomized to receive either glutamate or placebo. Now, as a double blind, I don't know what they're getting, and they don't know what they're getting. The only person that knows is this unblinded research assistant that has no interaction with the subjects. And so they take the pills over 3 days, 3 mornings, and we monitor them for 2 hours afterwards. On the 3rd day of the week, we assess them to say, do they have symptoms? What are they experiencing? Then they have a 6-day washout period, and the next week they go through 3 days again, and this time they're receiving the opposite contingency of the one they did before. So it allows everyone to serve as their own control, which gives us a lot of power inside a study, and that's why we could get away with only 40 subjects in our study. If you did not have that crossover design, we would have needed more subjects. And what we found was, when we compared pre-diet to post-diet, we saw a significant improvement across the board in every measure we studied. The paper that you're referring to really summarized the results from their total symptom score, meaning how many of their symptoms went away. On average, we saw that people had 9 symptoms remit or go away after 1 month on the diet. We also saw significant improvements in pain and significant improvements in their fatigue level. So that fatigue went down. We have other publications that are coming out that are looking at their cognitive change. We saw significant improvements in cognitive function after 1 month on the diet. We also saw significant improvements in those 3 mood measures I talked about. So depression, anxiety, and PTSD, which is just to say how profound this change was in these symptoms. I couldn't state this strongly enough. Like, to the point, brought us to tears sometimes hearing their stories. Because they were so impacted by all of these symptoms and had been for so many years, because you can imagine this conflict was 90, 91, right? So it was just beyond profound. So then when we analyzed the challenge results, of course, the challenge is really there. And in our prior fibromyalgia work, what we found was when we challenged them with glutamate, the symptoms significantly returned as compared to placebo. So that's what we were expecting here as well. But what we found was really interesting. Our models were significant, but it was significant because we were seeing significant differences between individuals. And so we had our largest group actually did react that way, where we gave them glutamate, their symptoms returned. We had another group, though, that their symptoms significantly improved even more when we gave them glutamate, which was very different from our other research. And then we had a really small number of people who didn't seem to respond to the challenge. And so this group over here that got better is really just fascinating. And we're again seeing that across all of the measures. And so we're really looking forward to figuring out exactly what's going on here. A couple things that this diet does is we're improving nutritional status. So we're taking all of these nutrients that are really important for protecting against excitotoxicity from glutamate, and we're increasing them in the diet. And so we're wondering if that is somehow altering how their body is using glutamate, and that it's able to handle that challenge now in a more positive manner as opposed to before, how their body was doing it. We also had, this is not published yet, but we were just talking about microglial cells, and one of the cytokines I mentioned, IL-1 beta, we saw a significant reduction in IL-1 beta from pre-diet to post-diet. And so that suggests that there is also some kind of, we're affecting neuroinflammation potentially too. And so it could be that we're stopping that cycle between that inflammation and the glutamate. And so we're really hoping to kind of go down that road and explore it more in our future research.
Right. So a lot of what you're doing is you're really optimizing the neuroimmune response in a healthy way.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is great. And like you mentioned, when you're able to do that effectively, optimize the nervous system and the immune system, that's when you see things like pain, cognitive function, anxiety, depression, all the things that you're mentioning just all start to change at once.
Yes. Yeah. Which is what's so profound, when you mentioned the effect size for the study, the effect size is very large. And, really, if we compare this to a drug study, if I was a drug manufacturer, I would only be attempting to take care of one of these symptoms. Mm-hmm. And if I reduce that one symptom by 30%, I could market my drug and say, oh, it improved your one symptom by 30%. And this is just so profound because it improved everything across the board. And we had symptoms completely going away on the diet. And just, you might find this really interesting. Being in the physical therapy world, we want people to be active too, right? That's that other big piece of the puzzle. And these subjects really aren't active. Many of them are actually obese because they're in pain and so fatigued and feel so awful that they really can't exercise. And some of them were in peak physical condition when they were in the Gulf War, and it just kills them that they're in this kind of condition now. And as much as someone might say to them, go exercise, you should start exercising, they physically don't feel like they're capable. But after the month on the diet, we had a lot of subjects. We followed up with them 3 months after the study. Not only were the majority of subjects still following the diet, but we were hearing a lot of reports about people saying, I can exercise again. Mm-hmm. I've started walking, I've started lifting weights, I am able to start being physically active. And that was it was so huge. And many times it had even more to do with the fatigue than it did the pain. Yeah. They really felt like, oh, now I can actually work on this other aspect, which before I felt like I couldn't.
Yeah, I mean, as I'm reading through your study, and of course I know there's a lot of variables you're tracking, but tracking some kind of physical function outcome would be really interesting to look at, because you mentioned you're seeing them, you're observing them. I'd love to see some objective data on that. But I want to just kind of back up like a car length. You mentioned that through the dietary intervention, you're optimizing certain nutrients that have an impact on glutamate, probably absorption or reabsorption in some way. Was that just through a whole foods approach, or were you optimizing with supplements? How was that attempted?
It's from a whole foods approach. So part of the dietary training that I do with everyone is I'm teaching people where nutrients are found. So where are they actually found in the diet? Not in a supplement form, not in a fortified food form. Where are they actually found? And so not only are we teaching people how to avoid glutamate in the diet, but we're also saying, let me teach you how to eat. So what are those healthiest foods and how do you balance them out to create a healthy diet? Mm-hmm. So we created a document listing the foods highest in each micronutrient. I tell them about some of the ones that are most important from a glutamate perspective. And then we're basically asking them to incorporate those foods into their diet more. We also supply some sample recipes, and we're actually going to even try to do this more for our next study, where we're really incorporating a lot of those foods that are highest in each micronutrient into those recipes even more. Just to give you an example, like magnesium is very important to protect against glutamate excitotoxicity. The best source of magnesium is pumpkin seeds. And so people might not, if they don't want to snack on pumpkin seeds, they might be like, where do I use these, right? And so now we're showing them some ways that they can actually incorporate them into some dishes. So.
And of course, that magnesium is important for that MDMA receptor, which is important with regard to central sensitization, everything we're talking about today.
Yeah, that NMDA receptor is a glutamate receptor, and it's probably one of the key glutamate receptors.
Yeah. And so you mentioned that you, as of course being the chief investigator, but you're also the one who counseled them on nutrition. Mm-hmm. And give us an idea. So you mentioned that sounds like you just spent one session with them, but they also had time to maybe email you or had some kind of communication with you throughout. I just want to point this out to people also. It was only a 1 month intervention, which is really interesting to me because oftentimes we want to see effects after like 3 months, but you're having such good outcomes after 1 month, which I think is, we should mention that. But how much time are you spending with each participant as far as working on nutrition education?
Yeah, so it was about an hour and a half session with them to teach them the diet. There are a lot of materials though, so I shouldn't estimate that in a sense. We provide them with a lot of materials that really help them along the way. They receive a list of food additives to avoid that contain free glutamate. We have a list of foods that are commonly contain free glutamate naturally that they should avoid. We have a list of foods highest in each micronutrient. We talk about antioxidants, and we talk about the foods that are highest in antioxidants and trying to incorporate those, and we give them recipes. So we talk a lot about shopping and stuff and kind of help them along the way. So really where their communication with me after the fact comes in is in that initial transition. If you can imagine, if I was to tell you, I want you to start this diet on Monday, and I want you to completely take everything out of your household that has these additives in it. And then I want you to replace these things with things that are safe. That's basically what these people are doing. We really stress that people can't do it halfway. We really want people to do it 100%. Mm-hmm. So getting them set up at that beginning stage is the most work, right? They're going to the grocery store and they're reading labels for the first time in their lives. And they're like, oh my gosh, this is so scary. So if I was to tell your listeners to give them like a simple way to think about this, if they wanted to do something themselves, I would say start reading labels and read those ingredients, and that you should follow this 3 rules of thumb, that these lists should be short. If you see a long list, just put it back on the shelf because it's not worth your time, right? It should be short, easy to read. So they shouldn't be complicated words. You should be able to understand them. And the last one's really important. It should be an ingredient you could add to a food if you were cooking. And this helps with ones that are really difficult. I'll give you an example. There's a term natural flavor, and you've probably seen it on labels. Natural flavor sounds so innocuous, and people see it and go, oh, it's natural.
Natural, yeah, it's good. It must be good for me.
Yeah. But what happens is because glutamate comes from these natural protein sources that they use in a lab, they break it apart and then they have the glutamate. They call it a natural flavor. And it's not always glutamate, but a lot of times it is. And so that term people aren't scared of. But once I tell them you have to be able to add it to a food when you're cooking, they say, oh, wait, I don't have natural flavor in my cabinet, And so it really helps people kind of think about it differently. Even the term spices or seasonings, they're very tricky. And the food industry allows those to be used because it protects trade secrets of what's in the food. And I've even seen labels where they say cumin, coriander, spices. You should always ask yourself, wait a minute, aren't cumin and coriander spices? Why this other word here, right? And so when you start thinking about it differently and, you're looking at these labels, you start realizing how much stuff is added to food. And if you follow those 3 simple steps, it really helps you kind of go, even ice cream. People go into the ice cream aisle and they start reading ice cream labels and they're like, oh my goodness, I had no idea what was being added to my food. And so it's very eye-opening. And so I hope that answered your question.
It does. And I always tell people, if it comes in a box, a can, or made by man, you want to be very cautious and look what's in the ingredients.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Good rule of thumb.
What you're saying with regard to, you're asking people to buy all in on day one. And I talk about the pros and cons of that. And obviously with this, study, lots of pros behind it. Some people who will look at it from a behavioral perspective and look at someone's readiness to change, so to speak, would say, well, I'd like to see like a longer period of, dietary change, or, a runway for them to start on. But I do think your study actually lends to the fact that maybe with certain people with certain conditions, this is the best way to approach diet. Because if glutamate is in fact having an influence on people with Gulf War syndrome, then maybe just one package of processed food a week could offset that entire balance.
Yeah. Well, I think what it does is it makes people think that the diet's not working, right? And so you can't really wade into it. You have to by making the more drastic change, all of a sudden you can feel how much better you feel. We commonly have subjects report by the end of the first week, they start feeling better. So you were talking about even having it be a 1-month study. It does not take a long time. And that's a really important point, is that when you do something fully and then you can really feel the effect, it's very reinforcing, right? Because here, if I feel sick all the time and by the end of the first week I'm feeling better, I'm motivated to keep going because I'm feeling good, right? If in reverse, if I say I'm going to wade into it, but I'm not really feeling better, I'm still really fatigued, I don't feel like cooking, my pain's still here, why keep going, right? And I think especially with pain conditions, because when a person's suffering from chronic widespread pain, they are not feeling like standing up and cooking, right? And they don't have to be chefs. They don't have to cook. You can eat really simply and eat really well. So it doesn't have to be complicated, but even having a spouse or someone else in the household help in that initial step is really nice too, because that can of Campbell's soup is so much easier to open and heat up than to make something from scratch, right? And so it makes sense that it's kind of reinforcing when a person has chronic widespread pain that they're going to want the easy food and they're not going to want to do the work, understandably. So I think by helping them to feel that effect faster is really helpful.
Yeah. And that reinforcement, if we kind of piece that out a little bit, which I think is important to talk about, is that reinforcement. If they go on this diet, if they buy all into this diet, and they notice a change within 7 days, like you mentioned, a lot of people go on elimination diets, taking it anywhere between 3 to 5 foods, will notice a change within 7 days. It actually starts to kind of hit them in the reward system, if you will. And they said, okay, I'm eating better. The reward in my nervous system, in my brain, in the reward systems and parts of my brain, is that this diet is helping me feel better physically with regard to pain, feel better emotionally with regard to depression and anxiety, PTSD, all the things you're talking about. And there's a whole other aspect, the behavioral aspect, that comes into play. And that's why I tell a lot of practitioners that, yes, if you have people who, don't want to change at all, then there may be a place for just taking out, let's say, sugar. But for many of the chronic patients we're seeing in clinical practice, people with fibromyalgia, people with Gulf War syndrome, multiple comorbidities, that this may be a better option because it's rapid in a way. And that's what people want. They want a rapid change.
I agree. Yeah.
So you mentioned from this study, it sounds like there were a couple others that kind of came off the spoke of the wheel, so to speak. There's one on cognitive function. Is there another one that we should look out for?
Yeah, we have one we're working on right now, looking at those mood measures I mentioned. And again, this is huge, this effect on depression, anxiety, and PTSD. I would say in some ways, this has been more impactful than anything for these individuals who suffer from these things. PTSD, I'll give you an example. We had a person in the study who was suffering from severe PTSD, but who loved to go to basketball games. His trigger for his PTSD was crowds. And so you can imagine going into a stadium full of people. It was really difficult. And he had a service dog, and the service dog would come in. He'd enter the stadium. The service dog would circle him, take him about 15 minutes. He would feel like he was going to die. He was sweating profusely, feeling like he's going to have a heart attack and pass out. And he'd have to get through it, and then he could go watch the game. By the end of the diet, he went into the stadium, and even his dog could tell the difference. Dog circled him once and sat down and looked up at him, and all he had was this little increase in his heart rate, and he goes, oh my gosh, this is absolutely amazing, right? We also had people, we don't have a measure to capture it in the study, but we had people report that they had severe anger responses, like kind of abnormally angry, that was affecting their relationships with their spouse or other family members. And that improved drastically on the diet so that they were able to interact with people in a completely different way. And so you can imagine those things are so impactful on a day-to-day basis, in addition to things like the pain getting better. So it was exciting.
Yeah, nutrition is fascinating when you really start to work with them the level you're working with it, when you see both the physical as well as the cognitive and behavioral changes that happen, as we're talking about here, just in a matter of 4 weeks. You're like, okay, let's continue to obviously research this. Let's continue to educate people about this. So we really appreciate you coming and joining us this week on the Healing Pain podcast. And as your work rolls out, which I know you're working on other things at American University, please let us know. And we hope to share them here. But in the meantime, let everyone know how they can learn more information about you.
Okay. Probably the easiest way, if they're interested in what we're working on currently, is to go to our lab website, and that's at americanuniversity.edu. They can look up, my lab is called the Nutritional Neuroscience Lab. So it's easy to find. I think it's the first thing that pops up if you type that into Google. So.
Excellent. So make sure you check out that link. We'll include it in the show notes. And of course, you can check out the paper August 2020 in the Journal of Nutrients. It's called The Low Glutamate Diet Effectively Improves Pain and Other Symptoms in Gulf War Illness. I'm Dr. Joe Tatta, and I'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Healing Pain Podcast with Dr. Joe Tatta. To subscribe to the podcast and learn more, visit Integrative Pain Science Institute.com. That's Integrative Pain Science Institute.com. Sign up to receive weekly updates, leave a review on iTunes, and share this episode with your friends.